Here are all the topics that will be covered in the US Constitution revision video. This video is going to focus on checks and balances, how they work, and the significance of them. The three main principles of the US Constitution are separation of powers, checks and balances, and federalism. The Constitution's framers envisaged a constitution that would limit government and share the balance of power between the different branches. Each institution has powers to limit the others, as well as those reserved for that branch. The second key principle of the Constitution is checks and balances. This means that the separation of powers isn't just a clear distinction of the three branches of government. It is also a separation of personnel. This principle gives each branch of the federal government the means to partially control the power of the other branches, largely to resist encroachments on its own powers and to maintain democratic government. No person can be in more than one branch of federal government at the same time, the separation of personnel. For example, in 1992, Al Gore was elected vice president and therefore had to resign his position in the Senate. Similarly, Barack Obama had to resign as senator in 2008. In this sense, the three branches of government are indeed separate. Every branch of government is limited and constrained by the others. The executive branch can veto bills, issue executive orders to reduce the need for getting laws passed by Congress. As Commander-in-Chief, the President can initiate military action without congressional approval. The executive branch can also appoint all Supreme Court and federal level justices and issue pardons and communications. The legislative branch can override vetoes. The Senate must confirm most executive appointments. The Senate must approve foreign treaties, impeachment of the executive branch, controls for the purse strings, power to declare war, impeachment of the judicial branch, and can pass new laws to get around some court rulings, and can increase the size of the Supreme Court. The judicial branch can declare the presidential actions unconstitutional. Justices serve for life and cannot be replaced by subsequent presidents, and they can rule acts of Congress unconstitutional. Justices are permanent and cannot be removed by straightforward congressional votes. Presidents can limit the power of Congress in several ways. Presidents can veto acts or resolutions passed by Congress. President Obama vetoed the Keystone XL pipeline and issued 12 regular vetoes during his 2 terms in office. President Trump vetoed a resolution revoking his declaration of a national emergency at the US-Mexico border. Presidents can often threaten the veto to dissuade Congress from passing an unwelcome measure. Obama made 4 veto threats in his 2015 State of the Union address on the topics of stiffer Iran sanctions, diluting or overturning the Affordable Care Act, loosening Wall Street oversight, and tightening up immigration controls. Presidents can issue executive orders to bypass the need for formal legislation. In 2017, Trump introduced a travel ban on visitors from several countries, most Muslim-majority countries. Presidents can use their commander-in-chief role to deploy US troops overseas, thereby avoiding congressional approval of declaring war. In 2001 and 2003, respectively, President George W. Bush ordered the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq. The President can also check the judicial branch in several ways. The President nominates all federal justices, including when there is a vacancy to the Supreme Court. Obama appointed Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan, and Trump appointed Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court. The President can issue pardons and communications to those of convicted federal crimes. President Ford pardoned his predecessor Nixon, while Trump pardoned the media mogul Conrad Black in 2019, who had previously written a favorable biography about him. Obama issued a record 330 communications on his final day in office. Trump proved a little more restrained on his final day as president in 2021, but nonetheless issued 73 pardons and 70 communications, including one to his former chief strategist Steve Bannon, who is facing serious fraud charges. The power of the pardon is one of those quirkier parts of the US Constitution, a role traditionally reserved for the monarchs to act as the fount of justice. Seeing the power of the pardon among the US president's authority initially seemed surprising. The reason is contextual and historic. It was originally included as a presidential power to enable the president to pardon rebels in the early days of the nation, in the interest of national reconciliation. Now let's look at the checks and balances from Congress to the president. Congress can check the president in the following ways. A presidential veto can be overturned by a supermajority in both houses. In 2016, Congress overturned Obama's veto of the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act, the only veto he had overturned. George W. Bush had 4 out of his 12 regular vetoes overridden. During his one term in office, Trump had just one of his 10 vetoes overridden on a defense spending bill in January 2021 during the final days of his presidency. The Senate must confirm by a simple majority presidential appointments to the administration, including the judiciary. In 2013, the Senate blocked Obama's appointment of Robert Wilkins to the District of Columbia Court of Appeals, the second most important court in the states. The last cabinet nominee to be denied confirmation was John Tower as Defense Secretary in 1989. The last Supreme Court nominee to be formally rejected was Robert Bork in 1987. As with the presidential veto, the threat of a Senate rejection is often powerful and is more frequent. One example was Biden's controversial 2020 pick of Neera Tanden as Director of the Office of Management and Budget. When it was clear she would not secure enough Senate votes for the confirmation, her nomination was withdrawn in March 2021. Congress has the power of the purse and can turn down presidential requests for funding. Congress on several occasions frustrated Trump's attempt to get full funding for his Mexican border wall. Congress can check the president in the following ways. Congress can simply decline to pass legislation desired by the president, for example in their State of Union address. In the aftermath of several mass shootings, most notably Sandy Hook School in 2012, Obama requested Congress pass several gun control measures, but nothing was passed despite proposals being drawn up. Trump encountered similar frustration when he tried to get his own version of healthcare reforms passed. The nuclear option of impeachment can remove a president from office mid-term. In 2019, the House voted to proceed with an impeachment trial against Trump. However, the Republican Senate did not convict him following his trial. Uniquely, in the final days of his presidency, the House voted to impeach him a second time on the 13th of January 2021. Congress has the power to block treaties by the president. A two-thirds vote in the Senate is required to ratify treaties. In 2012, the Senate failed to ratify the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Although it passed by 61 to 38, it needed 5 more votes to get ratified. Congress can launch investigations into presidential actions where wrongdoing or serious concerns are raised. In 2019, the House Oversight and Reform Committee launched an inquiry into a potential conflict of interest over increased spending by the US Air Force on refueling at a struggling Scottish airport near a resort owned by Trump. The airport was seen as integral to the viability of the Trump Turnberry Golf Resort. Congress can check the courts in several important ways too. Congress can impeach federal justices and remove them from office. In 2010, a Louisiana federal judge, Thomas Porteous, was successfully impeached and removed from office for corruption in a near-unanimous vote. Constitutional amendments can be initiated to overturn Supreme Court verdicts. In 1896, the court found a national income tax to be unconstitutional. This was reversed by the ratification of the 13th Amendment in 1913. Subsequently, there have been attempts in Congress to pass amendments banning flag burning and prayer in schools, although these have been unsuccessful. The Supreme Court, in particular, can limit presidential powers by having the courts rule presidential actions as unconstitutional and therefore illegal. In Hamdan v. Rumsfeld in 2006, the court ruled against special military commissions set up by George W. Bush to try suspected members of al-Qaeda. In July 2020, in 2 cases involving the tax and financial records of President Trump, Trump v. Mazars and Trump v. Vance, the court ruled that presidents do not enjoy absolute immunity from state criminal subpoenas. In other words, the president is not above the law even when in office. The Supreme Court can also limit congressional powers. The courts can declare acts of Congress to be unconstitutional and therefore effectively require them to be repealed. In 2013, the Defense of Marriage Act was ruled unconstitutional in the United States v. Windsor, which marked a major advance for the legalization of same-sex marriage across the US. The system of checks and balances is significant in several ways. First, it often encourages political players, above all Congress and the President, to deploy other tactics to get around constraints. Hence, many presidents prefer to negotiate executive agreements over full treaties with international powers, such as Obama's nuclear deal with Iran, or to call a national emergency to secure additional funding without the express approval of Congress, as Trump did over the US-Mexico border. They also frequently issue executive orders that do not require congressional approval, though they can be and are challenged in the courts. Second, it is noteworthy that the president is subject to the most checks out of all 3 branches. This is a clear indication of the framers' fears. In their view, the main threat to good government was lying too much power in the hands of a single person. Yet arguably it is the office of the President that has seen the greatest expansion in its powers over the decades. In a roundabout way, checks and balances can also affect the timing of presidential initiatives. Presidents face particular problems getting legislation through when their party does not control Congress, a situation known as divided government. Presidents often lose popularity midway through a 4-year term, leading to their party performing poorly in the midterm congressional elections, and perhaps losing control of one or both chambers. Trump's Republican Party lost control of the House in 2018 midterms, while Obama's Democratic Party lost control of the Senate in the 2014 midterms. Therefore, it makes sense for presidents to try and push through major chunks of legislation in their first 2 years after getting elected. This can be seen with President Obama securing the Affordable Care Act by early 2010 and Trump getting his Tax Cuts and Jobs Act passed in 2017. As well as tactics and timings, the elaborate system of checks and balances also means that much of the US government at a national level is characterized by gridlock. With the levers of powers often held in different hands, frequently very little positive is achieved. By dispersing power, the Founding Fathers have ensured intentionally or otherwise that it is much easier to stop something happening than it is to achieve something positive. Arguably, this is not the fault of the system itself, but how it is currently being played. While the structure was designed to promote bipartisanship and different groups and factions working together, the opposite has occurred. In a time of bitter partisanship, the parties show a marked reluctance to cooperate and compromise. Even a national emergency such as COVID-19 in 2020 took several days of intense and often fraught negotiation to get the original $2.2 trillion stimulus package passed. Note that not all checks and balances necessarily have equal significance. The most powerful weapons, arguably those of impeachment, are rarely used and are even more unlikely to be successful. No US president has been successfully impeached, although President Nixon resigned in 1974 rather than face a likely removal from office. Even the presidential veto is declining in use in recent presidencies and is perhaps overrated as a political tool. Obama vetoed 12 bills in his 2 terms in office compared to Reagan, who issued 78 during his 2 terms in office in the 1980s. Very often, it is the threatened checks and balances, the threat of a veto or a denied Senate confirmation, that ultimately has the most impact. The checks and balances system helped create, enforce and maintain the separation of powers as outlined in the Constitution. However, it can be argued that the separate branches of government are separate, not the powers themselves. Professor Richard Neustadt wrote, "The Constitutional Convention of 1787 is supposed to have created a government of separate powers. It did nothing of the sort. Rather, it created a government of separate institutions sharing powers. So the concept is better thought of as a shared power as opposed to a separated one." This is what the intricate system of checks and balances is all about. Each branch would check and balance the other two. The checks and balances between the 3 branches of federal government, especially between the legislative and the executives, have important consequences for US politics. The framers of the Constitution hoped to encourage a spirit of bipartisanship and compromise between the President and Congress. Laws would be passed, treaties ratified, appointments confirmed, and budgets fixed only when both branches worked together. Let's look at some definitions that are key to this particular area. Firstly, we have bipartisanship, which is the close cooperation between the 2 major parties. Then we have divided government, which is a situation in which one political party controls the presidency and another controls one or both houses of Congress. President George W. Bush managed to achieve his education reforms because he worked with leading congressional Democrats. The problem with bipartisanship is that it can cause gridlock. Most recent presidents have accused the Senate of either rejecting or blocking their judicial nominations for partisan reasons. As a consequence, a large number of posts in both the federal trial and appeal courts remain unfulfilled for months, even years, slowing down the work of the courts. A common question asked is, does divided government make the checks and balances between Congress and the President more or less effective? There are arguments to both sides of this question. Some believe that divided government leads to a more effective government, where bills are scrutinised more closely, treaties checked more carefully, and nominees questioned more rigorously. The other side of the argument is that divided government leads to a less effective government, as parties close ranks and become more difficult to work with. Examples of this can be seen in the treatment of the Supreme Court nominee Robert Bork in 1987 and Clarence Thomas in 1991 by a Democrat-controlled Senate.